Good morning, everybody. So, hey, this morning, the way we're going to start things off is I've got 3 descriptions of 3 different people that have lived, and I'm going to kind of go through them. And as I'm going through these 3 descriptions, I just want you to sit there and try to figure out which one you relate to best, okay? So you'll have 3. You at the end of this, figure out which one you think probably you can relate to the best of the life that they had and the life that they have lived. So here we go. Individual number 1 might be harder for you to see some of these because I had to make them smaller and get them all on one slide. But individual 1 is this. Their grandparents or grandfather was a politician, all right? They have 3 siblings who are all entertainers or kind of famous entertainers. They grew up on a 500-acre estate, all right? Father was a nationally known entertainer, was well-known nationally throughout their childhood. So this person was well-known throughout our nation as a child. And they grew up in extreme wealth, all right? So that's individual number 1 that you can potentially relate to. So let's go individual number 2. And then you can try to think who you think these people might be too. So they're all people that have lived. Individual number 2 grew up in extreme wealth. So all the money they could ever want to spend on whatever they wanted. They grew up in the most famous city in the world. So they grew up in New York City. They grew up with a famous father known throughout the world. So their dad is someone that's easily recognizable that everybody pretty much throughout the world knows who they are. They had 3 siblings, and all 3 of their siblings are known actors that people would know who they are. And they started working in their dad's movies as a kid. So at the age of, I think, 7, they started actually working in movies with their dad. That's individual number 2. All right, let's go to individual number 3. Okay, this person, born to lower income working parents, so just working class people. Nothing special about their looks. So the other 2, I think on the first one I did have, I didn't write it on there. In my notes I had for individual number 1, above average looks at one point in their life. I'll explain that later. But so individual number 3, nothing special about they look, just common looking person. They had at least 6 siblings, maybe more, so fairly big family they came from. Common family who had no influence in society, so they were just part of the group, part of society. Nobody would have really known who they were or anything. They didn't draw any attention to themselves. And worked a blue-collar job in the shadows. So this individual just kind of worked a blue-collar job. That means hands-on type job, kind of in the shadows. No one really particularly knew who they were or whatever, but kind of just lived their life day in, day out. So of the 3 individuals, what I want you to do this morning is this. Which one do you feel like you relate to the most? And then I'm going to get your hands raised here in a second to see who it is, all right? So those of you who feel like individual 1 best is someone you can relate to in your life experiences, hands up. Nobody. Dang it. Okay. I was hoping someone would. I'd be like, hey, we need to go eat lunch today. So, all right. Individual 2. How many of you can feel like you relate best to individual number 2? No one there either. Okay. Individual 3. How many of you go, individual 3, I can relate to that. That sounds like more kind of what I know. Okay. And then the rest of you just can't relate to people, and you're just going, I just don't relate to anybody. All right. So here we go. Let me tell you who these people are. Individual number 1, Chuck, Miley Cyrus. All right. Now, the reason I say was a more above average attractiveness for a while, because she's kind of got nuts now, and now who knows. But at one point, she was like an attractive girl. Here we go. Individual number 2, Charlie Sheen. All right. And if you know Charlie Sheen, then his whole life was like tanked later on in the years, and he went like psychotic and all that. Okay. Individual number 3, Jesus Christ. All right. Those are your 3 individuals. Those are 3 people we're looking at this morning. Well, not all 3 of them, one of them. But here's what we're doing. We're starting a new sermon series today where it's just called Understanding the Real Jesus. And as followers of Jesus Christ, we're called to be imitators of Him. If you look at 1 John 2:6, it says this. Those who say they live in God should live their lives as who? Jesus did. All right? In Philippians 2:5, it says this. We must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. The problem with this is this. In order to be imitators of Jesus, we have to know what He was actually like. And in our modern day society, He is painted in so many different ways. It's very hard to get a genuine feel and a genuine view of who Jesus really was. So through this series, what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the New Testament writings. And we're just going to examine them in the Bible and kind of reevaluate who was the real Jesus. What was He really like? Because when we know who the real Jesus was, we then have a perfect example in order for us to follow to experience real life. And at the end of the day, that's what we're all hoping to find is real life. So that's what we're going to try to hopefully find through this series. Now, today we're going to look at two aspects of Jesus' life. We're first going to look at his birth and his upbringing, where there's not a ton known about him, but there's enough generalities we can get a feel for. But his birth and his upbringing, and we're also going to look at his baptism when he was baptized, okay? And what you'll see is this, is there are two very distinct traits you will see of the real Jesus as we go through these. The first one is this, is that he is very relatable, and the second one is that he is incredibly humble. That's the two traits we're going to see today. So first, let me just walk you through his birth and his upbringing, because through these two things, you're going to see he's very relatable to us, as we already just illustrated. Of the three people, and I said, which do you relate to most? That kind of seems to kind of grow up in the same way you did. Most of us put our hands up for Jesus, okay? Let me just read some things about him. In Philippians chapter 2, we get the concept of God and what he did, and just simply says this. It says, instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave, and he was born as a human being. Now, real quick, this is an incredible concept. I know it's a simple scripture, but it's an incredible concept that the creator of the universe gave up his position of being the creator of the universe and became us. Okay, that's just an incredible concept. It's hard to even grasp, but our creator became us, according to Philippians 2. Now, let me just tell you who Jesus was and look at his birth and his background so you get some of this. In Luke chapter 1, his mother Mary, she sings a song after an angel tells her that she's going to give birth to this Messiah that the Jews have been waiting for centuries, okay? And she's given this word from an angel. An angel comes to her and says, hey, Mary, you're going to have this child, and he's going to be this promised Messiah. And in this song she writes after that experience with this angel, one of the things she says is this, in verse 48, for he took notice of his lowly servant, of his lowly servant girl, and from now on, all generations will call me blessed. You have Mary going, I'm a nobody. I'm just a servant girl, okay? But people are going to know my name forever because of what God's going to do through me. And so what you get is Jesus' mother is just a common servant. The best way we would see in modern society, she cleaned people's houses, okay? She's a lonely servant girl. That's what I see. She's a woman who cleaned people's houses. That's how we would see her today or something. Next thing you see is this in Luke chapter 2. You know this passage because of Christmas every year, but you get a glimpse of who Mary and Joseph were. So his mom and his dad. And it says this, and while they were there, so this is in Jerusalem, the time came for her baby to be born. She gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him snugly in strips of cloth and laid him in a manger because there's no lodging available for them. So when he is born, they can't find lodging in a hotel or a place to stay, and basically they're thrown in a side room of some house that they can find. And the reason I want to point that out, it just shows you this family isn't someone that has a lot of pull. They don't have a lot of connections. They don't have the ability to be like, hey, we need a place, kick somebody else out so we can have it. They had no influence in society, and that's his mom and his dad. That's the family he chooses to be born into. In Luke chapter 2, you see the angels appear as shepherds in the field. And we see who the first people are who greet Jesus to this earth outside of his mom and dad. And it says this, when the angels had returned to heaven, the shepherds said to each other, let's go to Bethlehem to see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about. They hurried to the village and found Mary and Joseph, and there was the baby lying in the manger. After seeing him, the shepherds told everyone what had happened and what the angel had said to them about this child. Now, why I find this interesting is this. The God of the universe comes down to be born as a human, and the first people outside his mom and dad who are just common folk that come see him are smelly shepherds. All right, if you don't know what the shepherds were, they were not people you wanted to hang out with. How many of you have ever been on farms with like farm hands and stuff? They're not the cleanest people. They're not the nicest smelling people. Like, they're hard-working people, especially shepherds back then probably did not shower and bathe a whole lot and stayed out in the fields for long periods of time with their sheep. And so these are the first people, just common people, the people you would never go, these are the first people I want to meet the God of the universe. It's shepherds. That's who the angels announce it to, and that's who first goes and sees him. In Matthew chapter 13, when Jesus is about probably 28, 29, somewhere in there at that age, he goes back to his hometown of Nazareth. And it says this about his experience there. He goes back, he starts teaching and stuff like that in the synagogues. And it says, then they scoffed, he's just a carpenter's son, and we know Mary and his mother. We know Mary, his mother, and his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. All his sisters live right here among us. Where did he learn all these things? So he goes back to his hometown, and the people there know him as this one of many kids in this one family who's the carpenter's son. We also get this idea that Joseph somewhere has probably died in his years between the age of 12. We know Joseph's still alive at 12. We know he's gone by probably 28. So somewhere in that time, his dad passes away. And that's who Jesus is born into in that family. And when he goes back to his hometown, the people know him, but they kind of go, I don't really know what his name is, but isn't he one of Joseph's kids and the carpenter's son? And doesn't he just do carpentry and stuff? And we know his brothers and sisters. And how did he get so wise? Where did he get all this information? So again, he's just a common guy. No one really knows who he is. No one really thinks about him. And in Isaiah chapter 53, you get a prophecy in the Old Testament about who Jesus would be. And it says this, my servant grew up in the Lord's presence like a tender green shoot, like a root in dry ground. There was nothing beautiful or majestic about his appearance, nothing to attract us to him. And so we get an identification of his personal appearance, which is he's just a common-looking guy. He wasn't some beautiful guy. He wasn't a guy we put into artwork and stuff where you're like, wow, that's an attractive guy. He was just a normal, common, everyday guy. That's who he was. And when you read through his birth and his early years, you see a guy that's very relatable to most of us that we go, yeah, he kind of grew up the same way we did. He just grew up living life with a common family in a common town with working parents, and he worked, and that's all he was. There's nothing really special. He's very relatable. Now let me go to the humble side real quick. And the place we see his humility is in his baptism for the first time in the scriptures. So outside of how he was born and all that, you see him as an adult man. And what happens at his baptism is this. His baptism is recorded in all four Gospels, and very few things are actually recorded in all four Gospels. That's the book of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's specific firsthand accounts talking about who Jesus was. Okay, so in the four Gospels, you get four different kind of viewpoints of who Jesus was and the life he lived. This is one of the few things that gets recorded in all four of them is his baptism. And what we know from some of the others, because I'm just going to read you one account, from some of the others, when we get into this account from Matthew chapter 3, I'm going to read you, is Jesus is showing up, and he's just in a line with other people to be baptized by this guy named John the Baptist. So there's a man named John the Baptist. He's baptizing all sorts of people and stuff for forgiveness of their sins and repentance. And so he's baptism, and Jesus shows up, and he kind of just gets in line with everyone else to get baptized. And then you get into Matthew chapter 3, it says this. Then Jesus went to Galilee to the Jordan River to be baptized by John. But John tried to talk to him out of it. So John's there baptizing. All of a sudden, as he's going through the line, here comes Jesus. Now, most people had no clue who he was at this point. John knows because John's actually his cousin. And John has started to figure out, because of God speaking to him, this is the Messiah. So he's baptizing, and the next guy pulls up out of the line, just out of the blue. Jesus is standing there. And it says, he tried to talk him out of it. He said, I am the one who needs to be baptized by you, he said. So why are you coming to me? So naturally, it's the same way we would react. John's basically going, you're the Messiah, man. Why are you coming to be baptized by me? Would you baptize me? You need to do this for me, not me for you. And so it's a natural reaction, and it says this, but Jesus said, it should be done, for we must carry out all that God requires. So John agreed to baptize him. After his baptism, as Jesus came out of the water, the heavens were opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and settling on him. All right? So Jesus comes to him, and John says, I can't baptize you. You baptize me. And he goes, hey, I have to do just like everybody else needs to do. I need to do what's right. I need to do what God has called us to do, and I need to be baptized. So John, you need to baptize me. And it says John kind of relents and goes, okay, I'll baptize you. And what you get is you get a sense of his humility, which is he's God himself, okay? Sitting there as a human, and he's allowing another human being, John, to baptize him. And you go, that's humility. He's going, even I have to follow what God has set out before us. And you see a humble man. Now, what I want to do this morning is this. I want to explore these two things, because knowing he's relatable and knowing he's humble does you no good. Okay, you're like, okay, so he's relatable and he's humble. So what I want to do this morning, I want to look at two things. The first one is this, what does this mean in regard to our relationship with God? Knowing that Jesus is relatable and humble, what does that mean in our relationship with God, how we connect to God? And secondly, what does it mean in regard to our friendship, or with our relationship to this world? So again, knowing he's relatable and humble, how does that help us understand how we need to relate to the world and how to impact this world for the kingdom of God? Because now that gives us something tangible to go from. All right, so here we go. First, what does this mean in regard to our relationship with God? That he is relatable and he is humble. It means this, that God knows you perfectly. He knows exactly what it's like to be you, which is simply amazing if you think about it. That the God who created you, the God who designed everything, controls everything, runs everything, he knows exactly what it's like to be you. He's lived your life. He's gone through the same stresses. He's gone through the same temptations. He's gone through the same struggles. He knows what it's like to be you. Knowing this truth should create a level of comfort and confidence in our relationship with God, because we know there is nothing hidden or unrelatable in our relationship with him. What I mean by that is this, knowing that God knows what it's like to be you, instead of making it a fearful relationship, it should be something that brings comfort and confidence to you, going, God knows everything I'm going through. He's experienced it himself. He knows what that feels like. And so you should find confidence out of this. In Hebrews chapter 4, it reads this, so then, since we have a great high priest who has entered heaven, Jesus, the Son of God. So he's saying Jesus is this great high priest, okay? Let us hold firmly to what we believe. Then he says this high priest of ours understands our weaknesses, for he faced all the same testings we do, yet he did not sin. So what Paul's saying here in Hebrews is he's going, hey, listen up. Jesus knows everything you went through. The only difference between it is he never gave in to his sinful side. He always did the right thing. He always followed God's lead in everything. He never chose his own way. He always followed God's ways. But he faced the exact same stuff you face, the same temptations, the same struggles, the same up and downs in life, the same persecution, the same struggles with dealing with people and how they attack you and say things about. He felt all those exact same things. He says this, so because of that, let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. There we will receive his mercy and we will find grace to help us when we need it the most. Okay? The fact is this, that even though we have issues, God still loved us enough to die for us. Knowing exactly everything about us, why we do what we do, the things going on in our head, the things that we do that we know we shouldn't do. God knew all that about us. He knew our weaknesses. He knew our issues. And yet he still went, I will die for you because I want to save you. So why do we fear him and fear talking to him about the issues and the struggles that we have in our life? Why do we hold back and keep those things away from him and keep from speaking to him about those issues and those struggles? He can relate perfectly to you and perfectly minister to your weaknesses if you would just allow him in your life. So often when we are struggling, when we're going through the trials of life, or when there are things that we know we did and we shouldn't have done, so often we tend to pull back from God and go, I'm hiding this stuff and I'm going to distance myself from him. And what we see from these scriptures and what we see from his relatability is this. Why? The first place we should go is to him. When we struggle, when we mess up, when we sin in our lives, the first place we should run to is prayer and confessing it to God and going, God, here's what I struggle with. God, you already saw it. God, you know what was going through my head better than anybody else does. You know it all. And we should be able to find him ministering to us there, that we should find strength in our weaknesses. We should find confidence when we doubt in those moments because we understand he understands us and he's relatable. That's the first thing we learn. That's of his humility and his relatability. It affects our relationship with God. It should bring confidence. As it says here, what is it? There we receive mercy and we will find grace to help us in the times that we need most. Now let me go to the second thing. What does this mean in regards to our interaction with the world around us? Okay, how does knowing he's relatable, how does knowing he's humble, how does that affect us to better relate to this world? And effectively impact the world around us with the hope of Jesus Christ. And that's what we are called to do. So what I would say is this. If we're following his example, we have to learn two things. How to be relatable and how to be humble in this culture. And this world. We have to learn how to relate to the culture we're in. and we have to learn how to stay humble within it. Who is it, where we go eat our food, that they have the good stuff? I just lost the name of it. Where they don't use the energy, the power, but they cook good food, mashed potatoes and chicken. The Amish, okay? God bless the Amish, okay? Christian society, I lost the name of them. God bless them and all, but they don't relate, okay? When you go to the Amish or you see the Amish, do you know you saw the Amish? Yes, okay? Because they are separated from the world and they aren't relatable to most of us. If we tried to describe our life to them, we wouldn't relate to them, and if they described their life to us, it'd be like, oh, I don't relate to you, okay? But we're not called to be that. Jesus didn't do that. Jesus related. Here's what we see in 1 Corinthians in chapter 9. Paul, the greatest evangelist for the kingdom of God ever, all right, on this earth outside of Jesus Christ, the greatest evangelist for the church. Here's what he says his mindset was day in, day out. He says this: even though I'm a free man with no master, I've become a slave to all people to bring many to Christ. So he first says this: even though no one controls me, even though God doesn't control me, I make myself a slave to him so I can bring others to Christ. Okay, I willfully desire to bring others to Christ, and by that I have to become a slave to other people. I have to find a way to relate to him, is what he's going to tell you. He says this in verse 20. When I was with the Jews, I lived like the Jews to bring the Jews to Christ. So I'm with the Jewish people, I live like they do so I can relate to them, so I can bring them to Christ. He says this: when I'm with those who follow the Jewish law. When he's talking about those who follow the Jewish law, you're going, how's that different? What he's saying is Gentiles are outsiders of the Jews, but they live the Jewish lifestyle. So he's going, when I'm with those people, even though they're not Jews, but they live the Jewish lifestyle, he says, I too live under the law. Even though I'm not subject to the law, I did this so I could bring to Christ those who are under the law. So what Paul's saying is this: I don't have to follow the Jewish law anymore, Old Covenant, Old Testament stuff. I don't have to follow that personally because I follow Christ now. But when I'm around Jewish people who do follow that, guess what? I follow it with them because I want to relate to them and I want to build relationships with them. And to do that, I have to live the way they are living. And so I relate to them so I can bring them to Christ. Then it says this. He says, the next group, verse 21, when I am with the Gentiles. So now he's talking about us. Those that don't know Christ, those who have never been Jewish, they don't know the laws of the Jews or anything like that. He says, when I'm with the Gentiles who do not follow the Jewish law, I too live apart from the law so I can bring them to Christ. So he goes, now when I'm with the Gentiles who don't follow the Jewish law, the Old Testament law, any of that stuff, when I'm with them, I don't follow it either. I find a way to be relatable to them. I live the way they do. But he does give a little caveat to this one. He says at the very end, but I do not ignore the law of God. I obey the law of Christ. So he goes, but with that group, there are some limits because they are going to call me to do some things I know I can't do as a follower of Christ. So there are limits when I am trying to relate to certain groups because some of them do things that are pagan. Some of them do things that God goes, no, as a follower of mine, you don't do that. And he's going, so there are limits. It doesn't mean I'll do anything to win someone to Christ. There are some limits. And he goes, but I try to find any way I can to relate to them. Then he says this. He says, when I'm with those who are weak, I share their weaknesses, for I want to bring the weak to Christ. Yes, I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some. I do everything to spread the good news and share in its blessings. Let me just point out one last part of that. You see, I have it kind of highlighted here. It says this. He says, yes, I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some. Okay? We learn from Jesus' relatability and his humility. Jesus, to save us, wanted us to know that we relate to him and that he can relate to us. And it's the same thing that Paul puts in as an imitator of Christ, is I'm here to try to find a way to relate to the community and the culture around me and the people around me up to the line that I'm sinning, but I'm going to find a way to try to relate to them and connect to them so I can win some. And this is interesting. It says, so I can save some. Paul's already learned, I can't save everyone. Okay? Paul's already learned a lot of people are going to reject the message. A lot of people aren't going to be saved no matter how hard I try. But he says, so I can save some. So he was used to failure. Guess what? So was Jesus. Jesus has a ton of followers leave him as well. And Jesus was God himself and still couldn't convince everybody. All right? So he says, I do everything I can to relate to the society and the people around me so I can bring some to Christ. What does that mean to us? What I tell you is this, folks. Every single day you wake up, the people you work with, the people you interact with, the people you have regular contact with, you have to be intentional about trying to find ways to relate to them so somehow you can lead them to Christ at some point. So somehow you establish lines of communication that somehow when the doors open to share your faith with them or lead them to Christ or whatever it is or tell them about Jesus, you take that opportunity and you're willing to speak up at those times and display your faith and talk about your faith. You've got to find ways to relate to them. You cannot go, I'm going to be separated from you and live my own life and you're over there because you're the bad people and I'm the good person. You can't be doing that because we also see Jesus is humble. In Ephesians 2, we learn this about having to be humble. It says this, God saved you by his grace when you believed, and you can't take credit for this. It is a gift from God. Salvation is not a reward for the good things you have done, so none of us can boast about it. Paul is very specific, and Jesus was very specific about humility, which is he knew as followers of Jesus Christ, it's very easy to receive the grace of God and then view yourself as better than other people. And Paul continually reminds us, and Jesus showed it in his own life as creator of the universe, being humble. He displayed it for us, that in every aspect of our lives, we are never better than anyone else. All right? A lot of times we have this thought as we go drive down the streets, and I saw this last week. I was on 71st, and I was driving down to get on 169. And there's a guy on the corner there kind of running up and down the sides of signs and kind of antagonistic towards the cars and stuff, trying to get money from them. And it's very easy to sit there and go, what an idiot. I'm so much better than that guy. I'm so much better than that guy. And what it really comes down to is this. No, I'm not. The only difference is I know the grace of God. Okay? We have to remain humble in our walk. If we are not humble, we will not lead people to Christ. You cannot view yourself as better than other people and continually lead people to the cross. Why? Because they know it's not real. They know you're a fraud. They know you're fake. You have to learn to be humble, to always remember I'm no better than any other human being that's around me. Even though our lifestyles might be different, even though we might struggle with different things, I'm no better than them. The difference is I have the grace of God and they don't. And my entire goal is to try to help them understand the grace of God as well so they can receive what I have. Because when they receive it, it will change their life the same way it changed my life. Okay? We have to remain humble, and Jesus displayed that for us. The real Jesus was relatable, and he was humble. When we understand who the real Jesus is, we gain the knowledge and the wisdom that leads to real life. So through seeing how Jesus was relatable and humble, we can gain confidence in our relationship with God, and we can gain an ability to impact others for the glory of God. And when we are walking with God and when we are impacting others for his glory, we will be living a life of purpose. And isn't that what we all want to do? Is find a life of purpose. You can find it through being relatable and humble, and understanding your Savior is also relatable and humble. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father,